Okay, good evening, everyone. Um, the After last year's focus on 5 essays of Rav Soloveitchik, and the feedback that I received, I thought maybe we would do things a little bit differently this year, and instead of reading through essays, pick 5 topics, really 4 topics, and then the last one will be on the Haggadah of Pesach, and a little bit open it up a little bit, make references to a number of sources from Rav Soloveitchik on these specific topics. It just happened to work out that I returned from a week in Israel on Monday, and I get to speak about Rav Soloveitchik's position, perspective, ideology on Israel, the state of Israel, and religious Zionism more broadly. The books, the references that are in the source packet come from this selection of tombs of books, of Rav Soloveitchik's writings, his essays, his correspondence. This is a book of Rav Soloveitchik's correspondence that was put out a number of years ago, Community, Covenant, and Commitment. This is a book put out by the OU actually this year, 2 years ago, about the return to Zion. It's actually speeches that Rav Soloveitchik gave, many of which were prior to the 1948, about religious Zionism and American Orthodoxy. The fact that they're both together in one volume, religious Zionism and American Orthodoxy, is something that we're going to come back to, because that's an important aspect of when you think about Rav Soloveitchik's religious Zionism. Thinking about the world Jewry is an important aspect of that discussion. These were actually speeches, drushas that he gave in Yiddish, and if you want the Yiddish volume, you could get that as well. And only afterwards it was translated into English just a couple years ago. We also will be a selection from the Rav Speaks, which is translation of Chamesh Drashot, five speeches that Rav Soloveitchik gave to the Religious Zionists of America conference between 1962 and 1967, and of course Kol Dodi Fake, which was an essay which was a speech that Rav Soloveitchik gave in 1956 to the Religious Zionists of America, which became a seminal work that many study. It's worth reading in its entirety, but we're going to use a section of that essay this evening as part of our study. We will make reference to it, and you have a segment of it in your source packet. So to begin, on the first page, I think there's some I like to sometimes people think of Rav Soloveitchik's writings and his speeches and his philosophy as very dense and very complex, and in some ways it's nuanced. It's as we'll see. But sometimes you can distill it in very simple terms to get a taste of it, and that's what I'd like to do here. If you look at the source packets on page 1, what you'll see is what I would suggest is a synopsis of Rav Soloveitchik's approach to the state of Israel. We'll talk about religious Zionism a little bit later, and from there we'll dig deeper. So this is a part of a letter that Rav Soloveitchik wrote in response to a request for him to write an essay about the significance of the state of Israel, 10 years, the 10th anniversary of its founding in 1958. And in responding to that, he writes as follows, page 1 on the left-hand side. I agree with you that there's a third halachic approach which is neither parallel to the position of those, quote, whose eyes are shut and reject the significance of the state, nor the belief of those dreamers who adopt a completely positive stance to the point where they identify the state with the fulfillment of the highest goal of our historical and meta-historical destiny. So in other words, Rav Soloveitchik says there are these extremes when it comes to the state of Israel. 10 years into this experiment, this homeland, the national homeland of the Jews reestablished, Medinat Yisrael, and the historical Eretz Yisrael. Soloveitchik says there are two extremes. There are those who shut their eyes, quote unquote, to the significance of this great momentous historical event. That was the traditional Torah Haredi approach. right? That the state of Israel has no significance whatsoever. It's just another stop along the Jewish journey. Makes no difference whether you're in Tel Aviv or you're in or you're in Telz or you're in somewhere in Europe, right? Or in Hollywood. It doesn't really make a difference. We're Jews. The Mashiach has yet to come, and it doesn't really matter where you are. And in fact, what they would say is that the Zionist endeavor, which was spearheaded by bareheaded Jews, by Jews who are not religious, were not observant, means that it is a invalid puzzle treif endeavor, right? So it's even worse than other spots in the diaspora because its founding principles, the pioneers, were people that were not shomer Torah mitzvah. That's one approach. You shut your eyes to the significance of Jews living in the ancestral Jewish homeland after 1900 years of exile. On the other hand, he says Rav Soloveitchik is going to say that's not correct. You can't shut your eyes to the reality of this amazing confluence of historical events. You know, you could call it coincidence, or you could call it the hand of God, but you can't ignore the fact that there's something here. On the other hand, he says there's a movement to view the reestablishment of the Jewish state as an end in of itself. That would be ascribed to a Rav Kook approach, that there's religious significance to the state, irrespective of what goes on in that state, whether it's a religious, whether there's observance, whether there's religion in that state or not. The fact that this is the location of the ancestral Jewish homeland makes it religiously significant, and that's part of. We're not talking about Rav Kook this time, but that was Rav Kook's approach. That the Chalutzim, that the Zionist pioneers, that a Herzl and all of those, even though that they disdained religion, and they were looking to establish, sort of the new Jew in the new state of Israel. Nonetheless, Rav Kook said, he'll palginon dibure, as they say, split the terminology. He'll accept and embrace and elevate and exalt and find significance spiritually to the endeavor, even though they were not necessarily on the same page religiously, spiritually, etc. So, right, that's what we might call today Messianic Zionism. The idea is that Jews in the homeland is religiously significant, irrespective of what goes on in that Jewish homeland. Rav Soloveitchik is unwilling to subscribe to the notion of Rav Kook's spiritual Messianic Zionism. It should be noted that Rav Soloveitchik made one trip to Israel in 1935 to apply to be a candidate for the chief rabbi of Tel Aviv. He ran against Rav Herzog and Rav Amiel. And during that trip, he met Rav Kook right before Rav Kook died. Rav Kook died in 35. In Elul, Rav Soloveitchik went around Shavuos time. And there's a whole question, how did he handle Yom Tov Sheni? It worked out well. Yom Tov Sheni, the second day of Shavuos, was Shabbos. So we don't know what Rav Soloveitchik would have done on the Yom Tov Sheni that fell on a weekday. Nonetheless, so he met Rav Kook, and he tells an amazing story that you can find online, the video, the audio of the impact that Rav Kook made on even those who were not observant. He was able to secular kibbutzim would have a kosher kitchen in honor of Rav Kook because he would visit them and embrace them and not disdain them for their lack of observance. So Rav Soloveitchik was impressed by the persona of Rav Kook, but he was unwilling to embrace the philosophy that Rav Kook espoused of what we might call a Messianic Zionism. That by definition, the Jewish state and the reconstitution of that Jewish state by Jews is religiously significant. It's the beginning of the flowering of the redemptions. Reshit Tzmichat Geulatenu. Rav Kook had that approach. Rav Soloveitchik not so much. By the way, just the postscript. Rav Soloveitchik did not win the chief rabbinate of Tel Aviv. It went to Rav Moshe Avigdor Amiel. At that time in 1935, Rav Soloveitchik was the candidate that was put forward by the Aguda, the anti-Zionist faction in Israel. And by 1944, 9 years later, not only was Rav Soloveitchik not associated with Aguda anymore, but he was the chair of the rabbinic of the Religious Zionists of America. There was this tremendous shift from that Rav Soloveitchik underwent from being from his family of the Soloveitchiks, the Briskers, were Aguda in the Aguda camp, non-Zionist, perhaps even anti-Zionist, and he made a shift by 1944 or 1945, and as we'll see, we'll understand what that's about. But certainly, we can understand how the Holocaust plays an important role. The Holocaust, followed by the founding of the State of Israel, plays a tremendous role in Rav Soloveitchik's understanding. Also interesting to note that one of the people that ensured that Rav Soloveitchik would not win the chief rabbinate of Tel Aviv was none other than his great uncle, Rav Meir Bar Ilan, because Rav Bar Ilan felt that the Agudanik was not the right person for the job. Somebody who had a more Zionistic approach, philosophy was more appropriate for the chief rabbinate of Tel Aviv. So Rav Soloveitchik says these extremes, right? And thinking about those who were with me last year, thinking about a process of the Hegelian process of synthesis, a thesis, and antithesis, a synthesis, right? So the extremes are maybe the thesis and the antithesis, but he would say this third approach, which is the normative one in all areas, right? I would allow myself to guess would be positively inclined toward the state and would express gratitude for its establishment out of a sense of love and devotion, but would not attach excessive value to the point of its glorification and deification. The state in and of itself should not be glorified, should not be deified, should not be viewed as inherently valuable, inherently holy, but rather we should understand, we should formulate it in clear-cut halachic language, as he says in the next paragraph, and we should also appreciate, you should not be blind to the circumstances around you, right? That the Jews, after experiencing one of the worst period of oppression and persecution and annihilation, in its aftermath, from the ashes of the Holocaust came the creation of a state. You can't deny that, and you should not be you shouldn't be ungrateful, and that's the starting point. This sort of sense of gratitude. On the other side of the page, Soloveitchik makes a similar point when he talks about Avraham. In this essay, it can be found in the book "The Emergence of Ethical Man," which talks about Avraham Avinu. So there's a question: why is it that Avraham Avinu could only be charged by God once he gets to Eretz Yisrael? He lives in Or Kasdim. The God doesn't call upon him. Only when he tells him to go to the land of Canaan, ultimately the land of Israel, does God have this conversation, this dialogue, this ongoing relationship with Avraham, right? So he points out that Rav Yehuda Halevi and Kuzari attributes metaphysical qualities to the land and endows it with a spiritual climate, right? That there's something unique about the land. There's certain inherent kedusha in the land. He says that's not only the opinion of the Kuzari, Rav Yehuda Halevi, it's also the opinion of Nachmanides, the Ramban, right? That if you look at the end of that first paragraph, for them, the attribute of kedusha, holiness, ascribed to the land of Israel is objective metaphysical quality inherent in the land. There's something inherent to the land of Israel, right? And that's why God speaks to Avraham, and Avraham becomes the patriarch of many faiths only in the land of Israel. But then he says, right, see at that last paragraph on the right side, with all my respect for the Rishonim, I must disagree with such an opinion. I do not believe that it is halachically cogent. Kedusha, under halachic aspect, is man-made. It is a historical category. A soil is sanctified by historical deeds performed by a sacred people, never by primordial superiority, right? So Rav Soloveitchik was consistent in this approach that it can't be the sanctity, the holiness of the land of Israel is not inherent. It's not kedusha me'elav, but rather it's as a result of what happens in that land, right? So to put it more broadly, Eretz Yisrael is a vehicle. The land of Israel, the modern state of Israel, is a vehicle, is a means to an end. It's not an end unto itself. That's Rav Soloveitchik's approach. Yeah.
So why was this vehicle chosen to begin with?
So that's a question, but ultimately, there could be lots of reasons for that, but it does not. Rav Soloveitchik is not going to allow that to sway him from feeling that to reject the Rav Kook approach, Ramban, Kuzari, that there's something inherent in it. So you're right, it's a question, and it's worth exploring, but it doesn't negate the fact that he's unwilling to go down that road, right? So the sanctity of the land of Israel is dependent on us, right? That's what Rav Soloveitchik would say. At the same time, so we're not going to be messianic about it. At the same time, we have to be appreciative of what it is, right? So if you turn the page to page 2, you'll see this is the section. We'll spend a few moments on the perhaps the major section of Rav Soloveitchik's speech from Yom Ha'atzmaut 1956 about from Kol Dodi Dofek, right? Utilizing the language of the Midrash of Shir HaShirim, that it's an allegory for sort of the dance that takes place between man and God. That God wants to get close to man, but when God wants to do it, man is not ready for it. And then when man is ready to seek out God and to be spiritually uplifted and inspired, God has already, moved away, right? And there's that dance between the beloved and the beloved, and this idea that Hashem knocks for us, and we're supposed to respond to that knock, and sort of the tragedy when the beloved doesn't respond to the knock. And Rav Soloveitchik says that the modern Zionist enterprise, before the state and culminating with the founding of the state, was a situation of divine knocks. God was knocking on the door to make his presence known and to make us aware of the uniqueness of the moment. In what ways? In 6 ways. We're not going to read all this now. Please feel free to take it home. We are going to sort of mention all 6. First, the knock of the beloved was heard in the political arena, right? No one can deny the supernatural occurrence that was the founding of the state of Israel within the seemingly natural setting of international diplomacy. And the fact that Russia and the United States both voted in favor of a Jewish state in the ancestral homeland was nothing short of miraculous. And he goes on to say, what's true then is true now, right? 68 years later, I'm inclined to believe that the United Nations was especially created for this end, for the sake of fulfilling the mission that divine providence had placed upon it. It appears to me that one cannot point to any other concrete accomplishment on the part of the UN. What was true then is true today, right? It's amazing. So that's one knock, the political knock, the fact that the world agreed, right? The international community agreed to founding the Jewish state. Second, the knock of a beloved was heard on the battlefield. The tiny defense forces of the state of Israel defeated the mighty Arab armies. And this is a tremendous miracle. And he goes on to say it's not only a miracle that the Jews defeated the large Arab armies, but it was a miracle that, quote unquote, God hardened the hearts of the Arabs to not accept the partition plan. Because had they accepted the partition plan, the Jews would have been left with even a smaller country than they were pre-1967. They would not have had Jerusalem. It would have been an international city. They would have had portions of the north, of the south, right? And just like he suggests, it's an interesting idea. Had God not hardened Paro's heart, right? And Paro said, okay, go, right? What did Moshe ask for? 3 days to serve God in the desert. We would have been stuck with that, but no, God hardened Paro's heart so that ultimately the Jews could get a lot more. They could be redeemed. Yetziat Mitzrayim could happen in all of its glory. So too, the fact that the Arabs rejected the partition plan allowed the Jews to get a lot more. Not as much as we got in 1967, which Rav Soloveitchik speaks about elsewhere, but more than we would have gotten had the Arabs been willing to agree and not caused, to use their language, not caused a Nakba on themselves. The third, the beloved, also began to knock on the door of the tent of theology. This is something that Rav Soloveitchik in his the explanation of keynote talks a lot about, that the Christian, especially Catholic theology of supersession, right? The idea that the fact that the Jews are in exile proves that the Jews have been rejected and that Christianity is the new chosen people. The proof was around throughout the 1900 years of Jewish exile, pogroms, persecution, dispersal, expulsions, holocausts, etc. Right? Why? Because the Jews rejected Jesus, and that's why they were relegated to off the stage of history. And with the founding of the state of Israel, one can even go further in terms of 1967, but even 1948, the Jews are brought back onto the stage of history. We have a nation of our own, right? And that is a strong rejection of this theology of supersession, that somehow the state of the Jews is indicative of God's preference for Christianity. Well, what happened now? The Jews have a state like all other nations. That theory, that theology is challenged in a significant way. Number 4, the beloved knocks in the heart of the youth, which is assimilated and perplexed. The founding of the Jewish state created a tremendous amount of Jewish pride, right? I mentioned this a couple of weeks ago, that this is especially pronounced, especially elevated, the aftermath of the 1967, the Six-Day War, right? Where after that, Rabbi Joseph Lookstein said, before 1967 war, Jews walked around like a question mark, bent over. After 1967, Jews walked around like an exclamation point, straight up with pride, right? That's a tremendous, right? That's a change. And that began as a result of the pride, right? The idea that Israel is an answer to assimilation is something that has been proven to be the case to a great degree, not to a perfect degree, right? There is assimilation in Israel, right? There are people that are not fully observant, although one could say that the trajectory of observance of Jewish identity has been upward with over the last 75 years of the state of Israel, right? The idea that the idea that you're either dati or not dati, you're observant or you're not observant, is a false choice in the modern state of Israel. There's a tremendous embrace in the past decades, but especially since October 7th, of observance, of Jewish pride, of Jewish identity, right? The phenomenon that we saw a number of times when we were just in Israel last week, of boys, young men, teenagers, boys in Israel wearing tzitzit, not wearing a kippah, right? And who cares? That's the way they want to identify their connection with Judaism, right? So this is a result. This is a knock that God has provided us a gift through the state of Israel. Page 3, the 5th knock of the beloved is perhaps the most important. For the first time in the annals of our exile, divine providence has amazed our enemies with the astounding discovery: Jewish blood is not cheap, right? The idea that we defend ourselves, that we stand up against our enemies. This is a tremendous gift that was provided as a result of of Zionism, and especially the state of Israel. Number 6, of which we should also not lose sight, was heard at the time of the opening of the gates of the land of Israel. A Jew escaping from an enemy's land now knows that he can find refuge in the land of his forefathers, right? The idea that the Jews are no longer vulnerable. The Jews are no longer vulnerable. There's a place, there's a refuge, there's somewhere in this world, in the aftermath of the Holocaust, where there was no safe haven for the Jews. No nation wanted to take them. Even when ostensibly the Nazis said, if you want them, take them. And nobody took us, right? But with the founding of Medinat Yisrael, that status has changed, right? So these 6 knocks indicate, Rav Soloveitchik wants us to understand, appreciate, be grateful for the gift that is the land of Israel, because that is tremendously important. and we should not lose sight of that. We shouldn't shut our eyes to the gift and the significance of these knocks that is Israel. Now again, it's not perfect, right? So if you continue on page 3, you'll see Rav Soloveitchik in the same essay says that Israel will not solve the problem of anti-Semitism, right? Which was a major piece of the philosophy of Herzl and even of the early of some of the early religious Zionists. Some early religious Zionists, like a few years ago, you can refer back to my Pioneers of Religious Zionism 5-part series. So some of the early beta religious Zionists, like Rav Kalisher, Shmuel Moliver, they were messianic in the sense that they felt that the way we bring Mashiach is by doing good deeds, right? We hear that a lot, but specifically the good deed of settling the land of Israel. It's going to be a messianic, it's going to bring about Mashiach. We don't have to wait. We don't have to wait for God to bring the Messiah. We can help usher in that era by doing our part by settling the land. Other religious Zionists, and really the founder of what's called the religious Zionist movement, which is called Mizrahi, but we often think Mizrahi has something to do with being in the East because it's Mizrach, but Mizrahi is really a contraction of the words Merkaz Ruchani. It was about spirituality. It was about religion. It was about Torah, and they felt that Judaism that we needed to find a safe haven for Jews to live Jewish lives, right? And so much so that the founder of Mizrahi, Yehuda Reines, in 1922, I'm going to come back to 1922 a little bit later in the source packet, Rav Reines was amenable to the Uganda plan. He was amenable to the idea that the Jewish people don't have to have the ancestral Jewish homeland of Palestine in order to fulfill the immediate need of safety, because that was of safety and assimilate and providing a place where they can live proudly Jewish lives, right? So from the perspective of Israel or a Jewish homeland to stave off assimilation, to stave off persecution, that for some could have been anywhere, right? Specifically as a ushering in of the Messianic era, that requires it to be in the same location as the first and second temple. So it's just an interesting point. Where does Rav Soloveitchik fit in on that? Well, certainly he would feel that the gift that is the land of Israel is specifically because it's the land of Israel, which we'll see a little bit later. But it doesn't solve all the problems. It doesn't solve the problem of anti-Semitism, right? If you look at the source packet, page 3, the assumption that the state of Israel has weakened anti-Semitism is erroneous. On the contrary, anti-Semitism has grown stronger and employs false charges against the state in the war against us all. Who can foresee the end of this anti-Semitic hatred, right? That really requires Mashiach for anti-Semitism to be ended. The state of Israel, state of the Jews will not necessarily end that. We're going to skip for a moment the last source on page 3, the top of page 4. And Soloveitchik notes that the state of Israel is not perfect. He's talking in the first 2 decades of the establishment of the state, right? And he says, let us publicly and frankly confess, we complain about certain Israeli leaders and their attitudes toward the values of our tradition and religious practice. We have serious charges against the secular leadership of the land of Israel. However, are only they to be blamed? And are we as faultless and pure as the heavenly angels? Such an assumption is without foundation. We could have extended our influence and done something to shape the spiritual character of the land if we had but hurried to awaken from our slumber and open the door for the beloved who is knocking. Right? In other words, why was, right? It's not, 75 years later, it's not exactly the same, but why was it that the state of Israel was founded by and was influenced heavily by secular Zionists? Because they're the ones that woke up. They're the ones that drained the swamps. They're the ones that built Tel Aviv. They're the ones that did the work. Rav Soloveitchik says we were late to the game. We sat on the sidelines. Right? We weren't as involved as we could have been, as we should have been, in order to shape that nation, that enterprise that was the Zionist ideal. Right? At the last source on page 4, he points out that one of the major mistakes of secular Zionism was that Herzl and others of the secular Zionist ilk felt that the state of Israel would solve the problem of the Jewish people's loneliness. The Jewish people are alone in the world. And if we just have a state, kechol hagoyim, like all other nations, we'll be accepted like all other nations. Rav Soloveitchik says that was a mistake. Because by mere fact that the Jewish people are chosen means that our fate is always to be alone. Whether we have a nation state, whether we have a democracy, whether we have that which is necessary for whether we have an army like other nations, doesn't change our aloneness, because it doesn't change the fact that we are a chosen people, right? And sort of the that's part of our fate, right? Soloveitchik has an essay about fate and destiny. Fate is what happens to us as Jews. Destiny is what we do as Jews, right? Fate is the fact that we're never going to be kechol hagoyim. We're never going to be like all other nations. We're going to be a lonely people because we're a chosen people. But we also have a destiny, and that's a shared destiny. That destiny is to be an or lagoyim. But we're not going to be kechol hagoyim. We're going to be an or lagoyim, and that's the part that Rav Soloveitchik feels the early secular Zionist pioneers sort of missed the mark. Could have been, and he blames the religious Zionists for not doing more, right? Not doing more to fill in that blank and to add the destiny part of things, not just the fate, not just wiping away the fate. And as we mentioned before, and we'll mention again later, the state of Israel is not going to solve the anti-Semitism problem, what was true in 1956 and 1958. Remember, it continues to reverberate very strongly and very true to this day. So what is, and if you just on page 5, there's another letter from Rav Soloveitchik who points out that the state of Israel is not going to solve the problem of anti-Semitism. Just read a couple of lines on the right-hand column, the last paragraph that's there. In all generations, the anti-Semites would choose a specific Jewish institution and mercilessly attack it. At one time, they attacked the temple. Later in history, they attacked the Shabbat. Gentiles would ridicule Shabbat and say that Jews are lazy and do not want to work. Later in history, they chose to attack circumcision and the Talmud, which were also institutions and frameworks. So at a point in time, they directed their hate toward the practice of shechita. In our day, the enemy directed at the state of Israel. Right? He says, I know this from experience. Non-Jews tell me, if not for the state of Israel, Jews and Gentiles would live in fraternal harmony. The state bothers them because it expresses and highlights the eternity and resurrection of the Jewish people. Right? So in some way, not only does the state of Israel not solve the problem of anti-Semitism, but it exacerbates it, right? It exacerbates the problem of anti-Semitism. And Rav Soloveitchik says we shouldn't celebrate that fact, but we also should not be downtrodden by that fact. We should just embrace it and understand it and not try to, not necessarily try to resolve it. We're going to come back to page 3 a little bit later because of that source that I skipped at the bottom, which is incredibly prescient as far as what the Rav says in 1956 could have been said in 2024 as well. The next few pages, so that's sort of the gratitude that we should feel for the state of Israel. We can't be blind for the historical trends that have brought us the hand of God, right? Everything that happens is the hand of God. You can't deny what has happened here. We should be grateful for it. It has provided a setting, an opportunity. Right? Like we said, it's not Rav Kook. It's not inherently holy and spiritually uplifting, but it is a framework. It is an opportunity. It is a vehicle. It is a means towards elevating Jewish ritual, Jewish identity, the Jewish standing in the world as an or lagoyim, as a light unto the nations. Soloveitchik says that's the role of religious Zionism. In the next few pages, and we're not going to read it inside, this is a section of one of the speeches he gave to Religious Zionists of America, and he utilizes as the point of reference the biblical Joseph. We're going to be reading about Yosef in a couple of weeks, next week. This week we get to mention him, right? Next couple of weeks. So he points out that in the Rav's topology, Yosef, and maybe not for nothing that his name was Yosef Dov. Yosef was the dreamer. Yosef was the one that was able to imagine circumstances beyond what was in front of him. Yosef was the one that was able to see that at some point the divine arc of history was going to be that the Jews were going to be out of the land of Israel. They were going to be there was going to be this tumultuous break from everything beforehand, and we have to be prepared for change, wherever that change leads us. And Rav Soloveitchik says that was the hatred between Joseph and his brothers. The brothers were much more conservative with a lowercase c. Don't worry about what will be, right? God keeps hidden the arc of history of where this is all leading to. Let's just take it as it comes. And Yosef was like, no, we got to prepare. We got to be ready for it. We got to do what we need to do. And this is the argument that took place. This was the hatred that the brothers had. Yosef was always thinking about what might be, what is to come, how to prepare for it. And the brothers wanted to let God direct the course of history. And what Rav Soloveitchik says is that ultimately we see that Yosef was correct. Yosef gets sold down to Egypt, but that's all for the purposes of saving the rest of his family that would have been completely annihilated had there not been someone there to respond to this cataclysmic, unexpected, unanticipated change, the famine that forced Jacob and his family out of the routine that they were expecting to continue to live in. It was only Yosef who had the forethought, the perspective, the worldview, in order to be there, be the Yosef on the spot, ready and willing and able to provide for the rest of his family when no one else could have thought in those terms. And Rav Soloveitchik says, history has shown, both in the Torah, history has shown that Yosef was correct, right? And in the case of the story of Joseph, at the end of the story, the brothers apologize. The brothers apologize and and admit that they were wrong. He says that that's the same as 1922, right? 1922 with the founding of Mizrahi. There was a movement that was telling people that things are going to change, right? Whether Rav Soloveitchik specifically talking about religious Zionism or Zionism more broadly, the year that he points to is the founding of Mizrahi, but you can make the same argument about Herzl himself. Herzl said that, the world is going to change tremendously. You saw within emancipation already the signs on the wall that things were going to change, and that degree of change would significantly impact the Jewish people. Did he know that? He couldn't have known that there was a Holocaust, but he did predict that things would be tremendously changing. And what are we as Jews doing in order to prepare for that change, like Yosef did? And Soloveitchik says the religious Zionists got on board in such a way that they began to develop the land of Israel as a way to ensure the continuity of the Jewish people, even in response to unimaginable changes that were going to come up. Right? And as he says, if you go on to page 7 on the top, it's in the essay itself, it's page 30, right? Right? Our brothers, great leaders, rabbinical giants of Israel, it's page 30 at the top. Men of holiness and piety evaluated the future from the standpoint of a peaceful and tranquil and satisfied present. Communities of Brisk, Molov, Kasilev, Lubavitch were still intact. Narrow and hundreds of thousands of synagogues were filled with worshipers and Torah students. Right? Although the fire of revolution had even then already seized part of the encampment, some of the youth had rebelled against our traditional way of life. Those of true faith comprised the overwhelming majority of the Jewish people and the Jew of the street, right? Therefore, they believed that joining together with Western European Jews, who were generally not observant and not overly pious, would be dangerous for Judaism. Right? They were unwilling to, the Herzls of the world, the cosmopolitan Jews that we're talking about, right? The Montefiore's, the Rothschilds that we're talking about investing people and resources into the development. Why do we need a Jewish homeland? Why do we need Israel? We have Vilna. Vilna is the Jerusalem of Lithuania, right? And Rav Soloveitchik says that was the perspective of Joseph's brothers. The way things are, they're good. The way that we can continue to stay that way. But the Joseph of 5662, the founding of Mizrahi in 1922, was as one who prophesies and does not know what he prophesies. He didn't realize. He couldn't have known that there would be a Holocaust, but there was. And because of their efforts, their inroads, their pioneering spirit of developing and cultivating and creating infrastructure and institutions in Israel, they were right. The Joseph of 5662 at the bottom of page 30 felt that those very Jewish cities of Brisk and Minsk and Vilna and Warsaw, etc., together with their houses of study, right, would be first to succumb to secularism and then be wiped off the face of the earth. Assimilation and ultimately anti-Semitism would be their end. What do you mean? Everything's flourishing. Early 1900s, everything's right. No one can think that way. No, right? That's the role that Joseph played in the story of the brothers and the story of saving Jacob's family. That's the role that Zionists and religious Zionists in particular played in making sure that in the aftermath of the Holocaust, there was a place for the remnant of the Mir Yeshiva and the Panovich Yeshiva and all the other bastions of Torah that were decimated, but there was something left. And where did they go? They went to, for the most part, they went to Israel. And why were they able to do that? Because there was a Jewish settlement and because there were these voices of religious Zionists who created the circumstances, perhaps not as much as they could have or should have, but at least there was something there that would be able to receive it and protect it, protect these Torah values and cultivate them. Right on page 32, he points out, right, that that history has proven Joseph correct. The Bible sort of definitely shows it when the brothers apologized to Joseph, and history has shown that Mizrahi is correct. Right? If you look on page 8 of the source sheet, page 32 of the book that it's printed from, I would like to ask a simple question, right? The bottom paragraph. What would the yeshivot and Torah scholars rescued from the Holocaust have done if the Joseph of 1922 had not trod a path for them in the land of Israel, had not made possible the transplanting of the tree of life of Lithuania and other lands in the Holy Land? Right? And it was not intuitive, right? Just like Joseph's dreams were degraded by his brothers, even his father, right? Said, what is this nonsense? It's what saved them. It's what saved. It was Yosef's dreams that saved them. It was the Mizrahi, the Zionist efforts and dreams and turning those dreams to reality that saved the remnant of the Jewish people and the Torah community from Europe, right? So that's and they were willing to work with even those that were not necessarily observant, with Jews from more secular backgrounds, in order to, but that was all for a purpose of ensuring that there was a place for Torah Jews and Torah values in the settlement of the Jewish people in Israel. And that's if you turn to page 8, Rav Soloveitchik makes the point about how he he says 4 lines in on page 9, page 34 of the essay from the book. I was not born into a Zionist household. My parents, ancestors, my father's house, my teachers and colleagues were far from the Mizrahi religious Zionists. They too held, why meddle in the secrets of the merciful one? My links with Mizrahi grew gradually. Remember, in 1935, he's the chief rabbi, Tel Aviv candidate from Aguda, the non-Zionist, anti-Zionist segment of Jews in the Holy Land. By 1944, he's chairman of the Religious Zionism of America. Right? I had my doubts about the validity of the Mizrahi approach. In the final analysis, my roots reached very deeply into the oral tradition and Talmudic learning. My entire world outlook was crystallized in the atmosphere of the Rambam and Ravid. The land of Israel played a major role in my household. In other words, he then goes on to defend his non-Zionist. In other words, he says his grandfather, the great Reb Chaim of Brisk, was a non-Zionist. He was not in favor of the Zionist enterprise, especially because of all the irreligious, not observant, anti-religious people that were part of that. But he loved the land of Israel, right? The land of Israel is distinct and separate from Zionism, he would say, right? And he goes on in beautiful language to talk about how much he loved the land of Israel, and when he prayed the sections of the high holiday prayers, Simcha le'artzecha, Sasam li'recha, it was incredibly moving to anyone who heard it, to anyone who saw it. And but if you turn to page 10, he gets to the crux of it. If I now right? In that paragraph, if I now identify with the Mizrahi against my family tradition, it is only because, as previously clarified, I feel that divine providence ruled like Joseph and against his brothers, that he employs secular Jews as instruments to bring to fruition his great plans regarding the land of Israel. I also believe that there will be no place for Torah in Israel today were not for the Mizrahi. Right? So it's two things. Number one, he's willing to overlook, he's willing to acknowledge and not completely invalidate the role of the non-observant Jews that were Zionists. That itself does not invalidate the whole enterprise. And number two, Mizrahi were the ones that ensured that that the voice of Torah, the voice of tradition, would be incorporated into the founding the founding values and philosophy that created the state of Israel. Right? There's the famous story about Rav Yehuda Maimon, who was one of the people at the one of the people who were involved, one of the signers of the Declaration of Independence. And we have a copy of which in the lobby. On your way out, you can check it out. Look for Rabbi Yehuda Maimon's signature. And above his name, it says Beis Ayin Zayin Hey, Be'ezrat Hashem. There's no mention of God in the Declaration of Independence. It talks about a Tzur Yisrael, Rock of Israel, which was the compromise. The compromise position was to give thanks and appreciation to the Rock of Israel. Jewish, from people say, right, Tzur Mishalo and Maos Tzur. We know who the Rock is. It's with a capital R. It means God. And secularists can say, no, the Rock of Israel speaks to the resilience of the Jewish people, the pioneer of the Chalutzim. So everyone can explain it the way they want. But Maimon wanted to make sure that there was Be'ezrat Hashem in there as well. That's the role that religious Zionists played in the early days of the Jewish state, and this is the role that Rav Soloveitchik feels Mizrahi can play and must play in the unfolding story of the Jewish people in Israel. Rav Soloveitchik, in an essay, in a speech actually from 1948, right before the founding of the state, talks about the fact that while the Jewish people are in exile, there's a Kabbalistic idea that the Shekhinah, the divine presence, is also in exile. And that the Shekhinah suffers, God suffers with the Jewish people when we're in exile, and when we are redeemed, the Shekhinah will be redeemed as well. And Soloveitchik has this beautiful idea in an essay. Actually, it was a speech from 1948. He points out that that the way that the Shekhinah, the divine presence, Torah, Judaism, is exiled, is somehow constrained. Number one, when Jews are influenced by the host culture, right? They end up assimilating and sinning in ways that make them less connected to their Jewish identity. But also what he calls tzimtzum, and we talked a lot about that last year, right? Where there's a contraction of the role of Jewish values that permeate Jewish life in the diaspora. He points out that even if Jews are 100% righteous, even if they don't sin at all, their ability to live expansive Jewish lives beyond the private sphere is limited in the diaspora. And he gives examples of it in the Talmud. The Talmud says, for example, 40 years before the destruction of the Beit HaMikdash, there were no more capital cases. There was criminal law was no longer exercised from a Jewish perspective. And with the destruction of the temple, the sacrificial laws were no longer part of daily life, which also meant that the laws of purity and impurity, right? Making sure Tuma and Tara, the whole section of Kachim in the Mishnayos and the whole section of Taros, of what's pure and impure, was completely no longer relevant. It was just a matter of academic intellectual pursuit, and that didn't have any actual relevant in practice. He goes on to say that the rabbis tried to maintain a little bit of something of eating chulin b'tahara, washing hands before bread is one last vestige. but it didn't last long, right? So the ways in which we express our Judaism is constricted, right? He goes on to say that with the end of formal smicha, of the chain of tradition of ordination that discontinued sometime in the late in the period after the destruction of the Second Temple, it meant that there was even more of a constriction of what is
Rabbi Soloveitchik on
what-
Zionism.
what is subject to what is subject to Jewish to Jewish values and to Jewish law, right? And Rav Soloveitchik points out that in the Middle Ages, still the laws of Choshen Mishpat, of business activity, were brought often to a Beit Din to adjudicate, whereas today, quote, all Judaism has been reduced to is the Orach Chaim, right, the ways of daily living, Shabbos, Yontif, and a few laws in Yoredeya, the laws of mourning, some of the laws of kashrut. That's it. When it comes to the whole corpus of what Jewish life can and should be a part of, there's been this tremendous constriction, this tremendous tzimtzum, and that affects the Shekhinah, right? And he points out in that talk, as Jews have been emancipated and been given more freedoms, they have not taken those freedoms to apply to their Jewish identity. In fact, they sought redemption and emancipation by de-emphasizing their uniquely Jewish identities. They thought that the way to become free in the Western Europe was by rejecting Jewish observance, right? And he says that, quote, through the Jewish state, we Jews have at least been given the opportunity to liberate ourselves from exile. But will the master of the universe himself also be freed from exile by the state? Or will he remain in captivity in a Jewish state, right? So Rav Soloveitchik entertains the possibility, unlike Rav Kook, that there could be a Jewish state, but who knows what the Jewish character of that state might be. And that's something that he's worried about, and that's something that he feels that religious Zionists can play a role. And what I would say is that role is not limited to what happens in Israel. He feels that could be the Merkaz Ruchani, the spiritual point of departure for an increase in Jewish identity and Torah values from Israel, Ki Mitzion Tetzei Torah, and from out, and then influence and impact the world over. And Rav Soloveitchik was optimistic about the redemption of the Shekhinah in Israel, because as he put it, life in Israel to a certain extent will be entirely Jewish, right? All of the kitchens of the IDF are kosher. The state specifically declared itself a state Friday afternoon instead of Friday night at midnight. Why? Because they didn't want to do it on Shabbos. There's a great line in there, must have been in Yiddish and translated into English, quote, Santa Claus will not have as white a beard, and the radio will not play Silent Night. That's right? Like there will be certain ways in which the Jewish state will demonstrate itself as a Jewish state, but the redemption of the Shekhinah from Tzimtzum, as he puts it, would be much more complicated, right? Because that does require the revival of large parts of Torah to practical relevance, especially those areas that don't apply to the individual but to the community, right? The dream of Israel is, Rav Soloveitchik, the dream of a Torah life, not so simple to apply Torah to the modern setting. He gives the example of employment rights. What's the Jewish view? What's Halacha's view of employment rights, right? And the Jewish state should be governed by the Jewish values and the halachot of employment rights, which we have. We have a tradition of it. It's in Bava Metzia, it's in Bava Kama, it's in Choshen Mishpat. But because of the years of exile, those areas have been stripped from their relevance practically in our lives. But he feels that the state of Israel is that opportunity to bring it back into a living, breathing reality. And so he feels that's again, the state of Israel is an opportunity. It's a means towards an end of greater Torah, greater observance, greater Jewish identity, greater connection to Hashem. And he points out that history has shown that the land itself is not enough. He says, look at look at the aftermath of the destruction of the first temple. Jews had lived in the land for 800 years. They all spoke Hebrew. They had conquered the surrounding nations, right? They had they had only their own unique Jewish lifestyle and customs, and yet as soon as they were exiled, right, the 10 tribes get lost. And 70 years later, the small minority of Jews that come back are highly assimilated, right? Read Ezra, read Nehemiah. So many of them are intermarried, right? Contrast that to the aftermath of the destruction of the Second Temple. The period of the Second Temple was one of tremendous acculturation, right? The Jews never had their own sovereignty. They were speaking Aramaic. They were speaking Greek. They were highly influenced by those around them. And yet, in the aftermath of that Korban, Jewish life got it stronger, right? And that's because of the role of the Anshe Knesset Agdola. And Rav Kook says the land itself is no guarantee for a strengthening of Jewish identity. It's what you do with that opportunity. He says that's the role, that's the greatness of the gift that is the land of Israel. And that is also the challenge. That's the role of religious Zionism, is to ensure that we take advantage of the opportunity that is inherent in a return to the Jewish homeland. I want to just end, since we're hitting the hour mark. There's a couple of last points. Just if you look at page 11 in the source packet, you'll see there Rav Soloveitchik's articulation in a letter as to what he understands the role of religious Zionism in Israel is. In Israeli political, I see two elements in the Mizrahi. Number one, an Israeli political party that deserves credit for most of the achievements of the religious community in Israel. Right? Anyone who is not an Ingrid must admit that if not for its work, our impact would not be noticeable at all. The Yishuv HaChadash. And so, in inculcating Torah values within the settlement of the land pre-state and in the early years of the nascent state. Number two, a large movement committed to a specific ideology and worldview whose impact is significant both in Israel and in the diaspora. And I think in many ways, this was Rav Soloveitchik's interest and embrace of the religious Zionist philosophy as he understood it. Right? Again, as someone else, they may not understand it this way. Many people think that religious Zionist philosophy today is about shlilat hagolah, right? Which means a negation, a deprecation of the exile, right? That really the only way to live fully Jewish lives or anything of significance is in the state of Israel. While Rav Soloveitchik doesn't subscribe to that approach, just interesting to think about in the subsequent years, right? Rav Soloveitchik is really off the stage in the early 80s, dies in 93. And you sort of wonder over the last 40 years, the direction of the centrality of Israel and what Israel has done and sort of the challenges that the diaspora has continued to have, does that change things? And many of the students of the Rav Soloveitchik have taken his philosophy of religious Zionism further. For instance, his son-in-law, Rav Aaron Lichtenstein Zatzal, went so far as to say that, no, there is something whereas we started with that quote, where Soloveitchik says, with all due respect, I disagree with Rav Yehuda Halevi, I disagree with Ramban. His son-in-law, Rav Soloveitchik's son-in-law, Rav Lichtenstein, said, I made Aliyah because it's only in Israel that I can live a fully integrated and organic, holistic Jewish life. And in the diaspora, that doesn't happen. You can have pieces of an identity, but it can't be fully holistic. Not everything you do, and as he puts it, if there's a mitzvah to settle and develop and strengthen Jewish settlement in Israel, then everything a person does in Israel, right? Right? If you're a grocer, if you're a farmer, if you're an accountant, anything you do, certainly if you're a Torah teacher, but everything you do helps develop and strengthen Jewish connection to the land, right? So that's something that can only happen there. Soloveitchik is less interested in that, certainly from his perspective, and certainly the time period that he's in, 10 years after the founding of the state, there aren't thousands of people moving to Israel, and Jewish life is weak in Israel and it's weaker in the states. His interest is to utilize the state as a source of pride and as a central point to inspire and influence even the Jews in America. How can we insert our internal values into the splendor of the modern world? How can we remain steadfast and strong in the very center of the modern society, sanctify the new that which is occurring on a daily basis with utmost holiness? Right? That was his interest. And that's something that Mizrahi, he felt needed to happen in Israel. And that was a model that he wanted to embrace and expand and utilize in the United States as well. And so it's for this reason, because he didn't want to be blind to the gift that was the state of Israel, and because he felt that Israel was the best laboratory for expanding Jewish identity and Jewish practice in a multitude of ways on a communal, social, governmental setting, right? That he embraces religious Zionism, even though, as we said earlier, it was not the philosophy of his family, right? And just to say, okay, we'll end with that, and just two more points. We're gonna just look. I'm not gonna read from it here, but on page 12, I'm gonna read again from page 3, but from page 12, right? So on page 12, Rav Soloveitchik, in 1967, right, soon after the Six-Day War, Rav Soloveitchik had gotten a letter from a teacher whose class had read, I believe, Kol Dodi Fake. And after reading it, they asked, it was so beautiful, written about the state of Israel and its importance and its significance. So they wanted to know, how come Rav Soloveitchik doesn't live in Israel? Right. So this was his response. Right. He just says, right, many factors out of my control prevented me. Right. I'm not searching for an excuse, or I'm justifying myself. I am guilty. And the blame rests on my shoulders. Right. This was soon after his wife died. It was a very difficult year, 67, for the Rav personally. Right. And he says that he's in a state of mourning, a sadness, and that's incongruent with the joy that is appropriate and deserving of living in Israel, right? So there's letters that Lubavitcher Rebbe supposedly wrote about that are out there about why he didn't move to Israel, right? Why he didn't visit Israel. So all the Gedolim of the 20th century grapple with this, and this is just one letter where Rav Soloveitchik talks about it. I want to end, though, with sort of something that I feel incredibly prescient. And it's like Rav Soloveitchik, he could be speaking to us today. Just if you look at the bottom of page 3, top of page 4, and with this we'll end. Sorry for going a little over an hour. But look, I'm just going to read it. It's really incredible. We too are living in troubled times, in days of anger and distress. We have been afflicted with violent pogroms and have become accustomed to suffering. Now, again, he's talking in the past 15 years, we have undergone torturous ordeals that are unparalleled in thousands of years of diaspora, degradation, and destruction. This chapter of suffering did not end with the establishment of the state of Israel. Although elsewhere, Rav Soloveitchik points out there was a difference between the suffering of the Holocaust and the ongoing suffering that was part of the development of the state of Israel, the ongoing war. There's a state of war even today. He says the Holocaust was a period of Hester Panim, that God's face was hidden from us. And the period in the aftermath with the state founding of the state of Israel was a period of what he might call Midat Hadin, that God was being strict, not that his face was hidden. A very interesting differentiation, right? But to this day, the state is still in a condition of crisis and danger, and we all fear for its future. We are all eyewitness to the rising star of the iniquitous and to the corruption of the international law by Western nations out of indifference to the principles of justice and fairness. All try to curry favor with our enemies and bow and scrape before them with false humility and shameful hypocrisy. All are concerned with the welfare of our enemies and remain indifferent to the suffering of the Jewish state. It's like it could be written today, page 4. With this will end. All the trembling and fear for the geographical integrity of the state of Israel. Right? This is 56, Sinai, right? Saber rattling of Egypt, especially. All the suggestions of our enemies, which are directed at territorial concessions by the state of Israel, right? Land for peace, give us land, and we'll get along. All the brazen demands of the Arabs for boundary changes are based on only one fact: the Jews have not populated the Negev and established hundreds of settlements there. had the Negev been settled with hundreds of thousands of Jews, even Nasser would never have dreamed the possibility of rending it from the state of Israel. Wide and unpopulated expanses constantly perpetually endanger the tranquility of the state. The Torah has already shown that, right? The fact that the Jews have conquered the Negev is not enough. Its settlement is what is important. You know, it was true then and it's true now. It was true then and it's true now. Both what Rav Soloveitchik said about how Israel is not a answer to anti-Semitism, and also what Rav Soloveitchik said about the importance of settling the land of Israel. In many ways, he felt that that was the mitzvah that's attached to, yes, Israel can help fulfill many other mitzvot. It could be a vehicle for Jewish identity and Torah learning and mitzvot observance, but especially and including and especially the mitzvah of settling the land, right? We need to be able to do that. And so, you know, he was speaking in 1956. He could be speaking in 2024. Feel free. I'll take any questions now, but feel free to take the source packets with you home, and we'll meet again next month and talk about another topic. Yes, go ahead.
Is there any correspondence between the Rav and his family about Zionism? For instance, his uncle, Rav